Hello, everyone. It is so wonderful to be here with you all. I am going to attempt to share my screen now. We'll see how this works here. Okay. Okay, here we are. So sawadee-ka. It is wonderful to be here with you. For me, it's this evening. For you, I know that it is bright and early in the morning. I come to you from the beautiful campus of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. What you see here is actually the College of Education. So I am the Dean of the College of Education at North Carolina A&T. My office is actually right here in the top corner. So if you can imagine me in this building right now, delivering this keynote address to you from my office. I am so incredibly thankful for the planning committee of the International Conference on Educational Administration and Higher Education for inviting me to come here. So Kab Kun Ka, thank you very much to the Faculty of Education at SWU for the invitation to be your keynote speaker today. Also, I want to send a special hello to my good friends over at Konkan University at KKU. I miss you all very dearly, and I'm so excited to be here with you. The title of my talk for today is The New Normal in Education, the Importance of Equity, Access, and Advocacy. And as I mentioned previously, I am the Dean of the College of Education here at North Carolina A&T State University. And my name is Paula Groves Price. I so wish that I were actually with you in Bangkok right now instead of in my office at night in Greensboro, North Carolina, here in the US. The last time that I was in Thailand was in 2018. And I had the great opportunity to actually bring my family with me. I have been extremely blessed to have visited Thailand 2 times. So I'm extremely sad that I am not actually physically with you, but do know that I enjoy the country so much and absolutely cannot wait to come back. It was a wonderful experience, particularly for my 2 children, to visit Thailand and to really experience the land of smiles and the beautiful hospitality that you all definitely show me every time that I come to visit. So I cannot wait to come back, and hopefully sooner rather than later. Of course, the global pandemic is really what is keeping us apart at this time. And I think that it's always difficult when we want to gather, particularly for conferences, and really have opportunities for global exchange. But of course, we all recognize that worldwide, the coronavirus has really had an impact on what we are all very much able to do. So I sincerely hope that you all are healthy, and that you have access to vaccines, if not now, in the very near future. As you can see, this is the latest data that's available. And of course, worldwide, we have seen that there are 159 million cases of the coronavirus. Unfortunately, 3.3 million deaths across the globe, but 94.6 million people have since recovered. Without a doubt, coronavirus has really changed the world. far too many lives have been lost, and the inequality that we experience across the globe has very real consequences for our access to healthcare, vaccines, as well as education. Many of you have probably seen signs like this all over, everywhere you go. Without a doubt, this has really changed our lives and it has changed the world. We have really had to make a lot of adjustments to our daily lives. Um, and our normal, what we consider to be normal, our normal way of life has really been altered. We have social distancing, we have mask wearing. It's very rare to see anyone walking anywhere without a mask. I know that we are always washing our hands. We are using hand sanitizer. Hand sanitizer is available most places. We are always told to keep our distance. Here in the US, we are keeping a 6 feet distance between ourselves. And of course, we know to avoid crowds. We're really restricted in terms of our travel. People are trying as best they can to really avoid social contact. And I know that for myself, I have gone over a year, right, without visiting restaurants. It really wasn't until I was fully vaccinated that I went and actually sat in a restaurant. And so I very, very much miss a lot of the social contact, hugs from our loved ones, and really just the face-to-face engagement that we can have with our friends, our family members, as well as with our colleagues. Big, big adjustments have really been happening in the field of education. And I would say that we have seen these adjustments from pre-K all the way through higher education. We've seen some of our schools close completely. Some of the schools have closed for extended period of times. I know that when COVID first hit, schools were closed for what we thought was going to be a short period until we really recognized the magnitude of the pandemic. All of our schools, for the most part, in both K-12 as well as in higher education, have had to adjust to remote learning, synchronous learning, right? Utilizing platforms like this and like Zoom, Google Classroom, all of these different technological platforms for us to engage in a synchronous manner. But we've also seen some huge shifts in terms of online learning and asynchronous learning, where students are accessing, they're accessing their learning through modules, and really not having that human interaction with a live human being where they can sort of talk back and forth, and really a lot of limited face-to-face contact. I know that there are universities here in the US that have not had any face-to-face classes. We were very fortunate here at North Carolina A&T that we did a very hybrid approach. And so about 40% of our classes this past academic year were actually face-to-face, with some students accessing remotely. And then, of course, we also had some of the online distance learning courses as well. But we've had to make a lot of pivots as we have marked off areas for social distancing. Our room capacities have shifted dramatically. We've required students, whether they are in elementary schools or high schools or colleges, to wear masks, and really stressed a lot of the needs in terms of sanitation and, of course, hygiene and hand washing. According to UNICEF, in the period between March 11th, 2020 and February 2nd, 2021, schools have been fully closed for an average of 95 instruction days globally, which represents approximately half of the time intended for classroom instruction. And so if we really look, I'm hoping that you can see this on your screens, but if you really look globally as to where a lot of the school closures are, you can really begin to see the inequality that we have globally. So where I am here in North America, you can see that the yellow bar here refers to partially closed. So most of our schools were not fully closed completely. We had closures for a couple days here and there, but for the most part, most of our schools engaged in some type of learning, most of it remote. And we tried as best we could to provide synchronous learning opportunities for students in K-12 as well as in higher ed. But as you can see over here, as we look at Latin America, there are a lot of schools that have been fully closed for extended periods of time. Here is South Asia. All right, so here we've got South Asia, and then of course, we've got East Asia and the Pacific, where there really is a very big sort of mixture. If we look at sort of the global averages across the board, that's where you're getting that 95 days fully closed. And so globally, what this really equates to is that more than 168 million children have been closed for almost a full year. 214 million students from primary to upper secondary education in 23 countries have missed at least 3/4 of classroom instruction time at the pre-primary to upper secondary levels since March 2020. And of course, we also know that the most vulnerable children are children who are in poverty, are children who experience systemic equality, are very much overrepresented in these numbers. So what I'd like for us to do is actually dig a little bit deeper into these three core concepts. And that is equity, access, and advocacy. And I chose these three concepts in particular because I think that what COVID-19 has really done for us in education is really open the eyes to many people across the globe as to the importance of these three in particular. But I think they also provide us some very important roadmaps for how we might think about our new normal and how we think about where we go as we rebuild, hopefully, an education system that is better for our students. I also chose these three particular concepts because they are the central components of our conceptual framework at North Carolina A&T in my College of Education. So here you can see really what we are trying to do in particular as a college. You can see our due statement here is that we prepare exemplary educators, counselors, and leaders who transform the communities they serve by solving systemic issues that impact students, schools, and organizations across North Carolina, the nation, and around the world. And so as we think about what our true mission is as a college of education and as a faculty, it really is to prepare this next generation of educators and leaders and counselors and practitioners who are going to not only transform learning so that there are more equitable outcomes for our communities, but also transform practice and transform the profession. So what do we mean when we really talk about equity? There is oftentimes a lot of confusion where people think that equity and equality are the same, and or equity and equal are the same, and they really are not. They are very fundamentally different. When we are talking about equity, really what we are talking about are fair outcomes, we're talking about fair treatment, and we're also talking about opportunities for our students. Here in our College of Education, when we're talking about developing equity-focused educators, we are also talking about really trying to develop teachers who are intentionally structuring education, rearranging contexts for learning, to ensure that all students can really participate and engage in the learning process. So that means students with disabilities, that means students from various different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, regardless of their language, or the amount of wealth that they have in their families, that we really are developing educators that can make intentional accommodations and modifications for students and their different learning differences. Moreover, this is also about helping educators empower their learners to advocate for themselves, to ensure that they also understand and know how to access resources. We also are doing work when we talk about equity to ensure that there really is a fair and equitable distribution of social, political, technological, and economic resources. We want to ensure that our educators are aware of the social implications and interconnections of global economies, that they are aware and understand diversity and cultural competence, and that they think about what the outcomes are for their students and the community at large. Global inequality in communities of color have really become a lot more visible and, I would say, amplified with the global pandemic. Uh, for us here in the United States, we really saw how poverty, communities that were in poverty before the pandemic, of course, fared much worse post-pandemic or during the pandemic. We're still not in a post area quite yet. When businesses shut down and closed, particularly those that were in the service sectors, we saw a large number of families that needed a lot of help. Families that were housing insecure, they were not sure if they were going to have the resources to pay their rent and to secure housing. We also saw a number of families that were also food insecure. So lines to get free food from different charities really increased dramatically. And the working poor, of course, were very much hit the hardest, particularly women with children, as childcare centers were not allowed to open. We also saw that there were disproportionate effects of having school closures particularly on families that needed childcare services so that they could go to work. We also know that those who were wealthier tended to also have jobs where they could telework and they could continue to earn their incomes from home and in sort of a quarantine situation. Similarly, as we look at health disparities and equity, we also saw that disproportionately our poor areas, our poorer countries, if we're looking globally, they also had, if they had a predisposition to particular risk factors and disease, we know that that also meant that they were at greater risk for COVID and usually greater risk for some of the more severe reactions to COVID. And so I think as we really looked at how COVID-19 has impacted education in particular, we really cannot divorce it from the larger systems of inequality that affect our families and particularly our children. And those are those systems that really run across poverty, health disparities, and of course, resource distribution. And that takes me to a little bit of a discussion of remote learning. And so what we really saw happening here in the United States, and I am curious to know if this is what happened in Thailand and also in Southeast Asia, but for us, our middle class families and our wealthy families, in those communities, children were able to fairly quickly pivot to remote learning and continue their instruction. And so schools were closed perhaps for 2 or 3 days as the schools sort of regrouped, as the schools came up with new plans for how they would address learning in a remote setting. And parents pivoted to remote work at the same time. Oftentimes, those parents were also able to assist their children with technology as they already had access to computers, iPads, and different technological devices for the students to be able to log in and connect with their teachers. And they also had stable internet connections for continuous learning. Teachers also in these wealthier schools and these wealthier communities had the resources and the skills to pivot their plans relatively quickly. This was not the case, however, for many families across the globe. And so what I want to do now is pivot a little bit to talking about access. So that was sort of the second piece of this. And in particular, thinking about what really is access. Well, access is equal opportunity to an education. I want to briefly take a short detail or a detour, excuse me, and share a little bit more with you about my current university, North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. Because the idea of access is really a core component of its history and also its identity. So North Carolina A&T was founded in 1891 and is considered an HBCU. That stands for Historically Black College and University. It is the largest HBCU here in the USA, but it began because segregation denied access to African Americans and people of color to predominantly white or what were exclusively white institutions historically. And so the mission of North Carolina A&T is really, and has been historically for the last 130 years, to provide a high quality, culturally responsive education to mostly African American and students of color. It's also a leader in STEM education. We have 10 colleges and academic departments. We have 9 doctoral programs, 29 master's programs, 54 undergraduate programs, and we are continuing to grow. We have an enrollment currently that is close to 13,000 students. But the history of our institution is really grounded in the idea that all students should have access to a quality education. What you see here in this picture is a statue that we have on our campus. And it's a statue of 4 young men who in 1960 started or ignited parts of the civil rights movement through their social justice protests. So some of you may know a little bit about US history and know that in the 1960s, with our civil rights movements, there were many protests to really fight for social justice and for the rights of all people to have access to public facilities, including restaurants and the like. And so these 4 students, they were students at North Carolina A&T in 1960. They were actually freshmen, so they were very young students. They ignited a movement with their sit-ins. So they did a sit-in at Woolworth's to advocate for African Americans to have the opportunity to eat lunch at the lunch counter. And so because of these 4, as well as the long history and legacy of social justice at North Carolina A&T, the ideas of access and social justice really are core elements of the legacy. And so a lot of the mission that we have here as an institution and as a university is to really address systemic inequality and injustice, not only locally, but also globally. What I will also add is that while we are a very highly productive and amazingly great university, we are still feeling some of the inequities that have been historic here in the US, particularly when it comes to things like funding. And so that has continued to be an issue for a number of HBCUs in the United States. What I want to share a little bit now is in the US, particularly for K through 12, we have a law which is called Free and Appropriate Education. And it's a law that requires K through 12 schools to offer equitable access to every child. Okay, so again, if we think about what is access, we're talking about access to an opportunity to education. But one of the big questions and one of the big issues that really came forward for us here in the US, particularly with COVID-19, is are schools actually not providing equitable access if our new normal requires a technological device such as a laptop or an iPad, as well as internet access? What we know is that across K through 12 and in higher ed, many students struggled with access issues. They struggled with access to technology and electronic devices. They struggled with access to broadband and high-speed internet service. And they also struggled with access to quiet learning spaces, right? So if we think about students who are housing insecure, having a learning space when schools and universities are closed definitely provided um, some challenges for our students. I know that even for us at A&T, the access to technology and electronic devices was definitely a struggle as we pivoted to remote learning. We were very fortunate that we were able to receive some federal funding to purchase additional laptops for students to utilize because many of our students did not have their own devices to use for remote and online learning. They did not have the funding and the resources to be able to provide their own. And so it was very important that we had to find ways to provide those devices for students so that they could borrow them, so that they could continue their learning. What we know in K through 12 schools as well is that there were millions of students who did not have access to devices, particularly in K-12. And that has really placed a large burden on school districts as they tried to continue learning with little resources. To give you a little bit more of the numbers here, when the pandemic began in the US, we saw that there were about 16 million students, and these are K-12 students, that had insufficient internet or no internet in their homes to be able to accommodate the type of remote learning or online learning for their devices. There were also 9 million children that had no access to computers. I know that in our local school district, where my children are students, the access to computers and devices was a very big issue that did not get resolved for many, many months. We also saw that there were shortages of devices, that even if a district had the resources to purchase some of the devices were actually not available for purchase because there was such a need and a backlog. And so what we really learned was that in a global pandemic, access to technology, access to devices, access to internet really equated to access to an education. And so for the US, we really grappled with, if by law you are supposed to have access to a free and appropriate education for all students, if you did not provide those technologies and provide internet service for students, are you actually denying them access to an education? And the last part that I want to touch on is about advocacy. And so here you see I have my slide which says to be an advocate. And what it means to be an advocate is to really try to influence decisions in political, economic, and social institutions. One thing that we learned, I think, through this global pandemic, as we think about this new normal, is that educators must advocate for greater equity and access for all students. Through the pandemic, we have pretty much put our new glasses on, and we can really see inequality much clearer, both locally within our own schools and our districts, and our states and our country, but we also are able to see it globally a lot more easily. One of the issues that has come forward is this idea of will we continue to provide accommodations, right? So we have pretty much agreed that COVID-19 has really interrupted formal education for just about everyone. And I would probably say that that is the case globally, right? Particularly as we think about all of the different school closures in different countries around the world, and different places that have uh, have had to do a number of pivots and how they offer education. But there are also students who are called students with interrupted formal education students. These are students who have experienced school interruptions historically, right? So it's nothing new for many immigrant children, children who are refugees, and really trying to escape um, some very difficult situations in their home countries, students who are housing insecure and therefore have had to move around to different schools and different districts, students who have experienced homelessness, chronic health issues, natural disasters, right? We have students who have missed and really had school years interrupted because of hurricanes and tsunamis and earthquakes and different natural disasters. But what we have seen with COVID-19 is that there really has been a more concerted effort to provide extensive accommodations in light of the interruptions that most students have experienced. So one of the questions for us as we move forward is, will we continue to provide these extensive accommodations as we understand perhaps a little bit more deeply how interruptions in formal education have impacted students who have historically been interrupted but not received the care and the type of accommodations that perhaps they should have been receiving all along. And so some of these accommodations and questions that I sort of have for us as educators to really think about is, will we continue particular practices, such as the suspension of standardized testing mandates? Many schools across the globe, here in the US, it depends on which state that you are in. Here in North Carolina, we are still doing standardized testing for students and with their end of grade tests. But in some states, there is a suspension of standardized testing and a recognition that it may not be fair to expect students, given the conditions of their learning over this past year, to ask them to also participate in standardized testing. Many schools provided free access to technology, provided laptops, provided uh, iPads and different devices to students, as well as internet service for students to utilize in their homes. Will we continue to provide some of those services for students so that they have the access to education that they need? In colleges and universities, there are a number of universities that have different exceptions to entrance requirements. Here at North Carolina A&T, we are not requiring the SAT or the ACT standardized test scores for students for entrance into the university for consideration as a part of their admissions. Will we continue to think about the disproportionate effects of things such as standardized tests, particularly as we think about those students who have historically experienced interrupted schooling, and not just because of COVID-19, but because of poverty issues or different circumstances of their lives. And finally, will we continue to have more flexibility and support for student mental health and well-being? I will say that one of the things that I have very much appreciated here at A&T is that we have focused quite a bit on our student mental health and their well-being. We've had mental health days where we have said we're going to suspend all teaching and classes, and we want faculty and we want students to take a day off, essentially, and to just breathe, and provided different opportunities for them to engage in wellness and mindfulness types of activities. Will we continue to do some of those things as we move into, will those be a part of our new normal? I think those are some of the questions that we will need to think about, but also as educators, be advocates for. What are the things that we've learned? What are the things that we want to take forward with us as we move into this new era? So as we head to a new normal, I think we really must ask ourselves, what policies and systems perpetuate inequities and unequal access to education in my country, my city, or my school? What adaptations did we make that increased access and equity for students? So the examples that I provided earlier in terms of accommodations that have affected everyone because of interruptions, some of those have particularly helped students who have historically experienced school interruptions. And also, are we prepared for another global crisis? So what have we learned? Well, I think we've learned a lot. Some of the things that we've learned are actually things that we already knew, but some of us we got so used to it that we stopped addressing some of those issues. I think that we know that our old normal was filled with a number of inequities, and that we probably should not 100% go back to our old normal because it did not address some of the issues and meet the needs of all students. I think we also learned that equity and access matters. Having access to education, access to technology, access to internet service, access to resources, access to help really matters as we think about education and our students. And we've also learned that one way of teaching and learning does not work for everyone. And so while there's a lot of talk about learning loss in the United States in particular, I do think that some of that is a bit misguided because remote learning worked really great for some students. Online worked great for some students, but not everyone, right? I think about my own children. I have an 8-year-old son and I have a 13-year-old daughter. Both of them we put them in the virtual school. So they were 100% remote this academic year. And they're close to finishing out their school year. So they're extremely excited that June 3rd is coming relatively soon. But I think that, but each of them experienced remote learning in different ways. I think it was a bit more difficult for my daughter, who very much missed the social aspects of school. She realized that she learns best with a teacher when she can comfortably ask questions, when she can have a more face-to-face sort of interaction with her teacher and with her peers, and that it's not always comfortable to ask a question when you are on Zoom or you're on Canvas or whatever your platform is online. For my son, who's a little bit more of an introvert, he preferred being online. He's also young, and for him, his big complaint was that school was too long. He wanted to play more. And so he wishes that the school day was shorter. And when you're online and you have meetings, your meetings are shorter and you have more time to work independently. And so he actually enjoyed being remote this year. But I think our big learning, of course, is that one way of teaching and learning really does not work for everyone. And so we have got to have multiple modalities and multiple ways of learning. Chow, Lam, and King, I came across this article, and they said that crises provide an opportunity for schools and universities to reevaluate the current education system, and for educators to be ready, resilient, and creative at all times to reinvent their methods of teaching. And I really liked this particular quote, especially as we think about what will be and what is our new normal, and what type of system do we want to recreate. I think we definitely need to reevaluate a number of our practices. But really, part of the idea here is taking a crisis, but looking at it as an opportunity, really to improve. And so they came up with this idea called crisis resilience pedagogy. And as a part of this, they talk about adaptability, which is teaching and learning methods need to adapt to changes quickly. And so, as I mentioned previously, this was something that was which was much easier for wealthier countries and wealthier districts and wealthier schools that had access to particular resources, right, as well as access to particular skills. But really what they advocate for is that we really should rethink our methods and rethink education to include what they are terming crisis resilience pedagogy. And so that includes adaptability, creativity, connectivity, diversity, and endurance. And I found this to be interesting, particularly as we think about sort of the year that we have all just experienced, but also I wonder, what are we taking forward with us as we are entering into sort of a new normal? And I think for sure, the adaptability piece is something that I think we have all learned. I know that for us in higher education, we have had a number of meetings to talk about our plan for next year. Our plan is to be face-to-face. However, we are ready to quickly adapt to a remote learning and an on-learning schedule, right? So we've learned that we have to be adaptable, and we also have to be able to be ready for that adaptability and for change relatively quickly. We've also learned that our students and our faculty are actually able to adapt with us and do it relatively quickly as well. I think that we've also learned, as we think about creativity, I think that we've learned that there are some methods to remote learning that work fantastically, and there are others that really do not work so well. But creative methods that address challenges and that are more problem-based are the ones that work the best. And so I recall listening to a number of students who talked about their synchronous classes and some of the struggles that they had was that when you're listening to a lecture, so this may be a struggle to you, this may be a struggle to you as well as you're listening to me do this keynote, but when you're listening to someone who is just talking and providing a lecture through the internet and online, it's very, very difficult to keep your um, to keep your attention and to stay engaged. And so we've learned that we have to be more creative, particularly if we are going to do remote and online learning, to really ensure that students are having a good learning experience. In similar ways that we would want to be creative with our teaching in a face-to-face modality. In terms of connectivity, I think we also realize that having that human connection is extremely important. But it's also important that we share and exchange our educational tools and our resources. So we see a lot of folks, you know, kind of hoarding resources or keeping it all to themselves. And really, we need to have more exchanges, having more conversations to creatively plan with other faculty, with other teachers, as well as share different ideas, resources, and tools for the benefit of our students. We also have to have a variety of teaching and learning approaches. In terms of diversity, I'm also a very big proponent of culturally responsive pedagogies. I believe that it is extremely important that we bring culture into the classroom, that we understand the backgrounds and the cultures of our students. And I think that that also means that we engage students through a variety of methods, that we are not only lecturing to them, but that we have some hands-on work, that we're utilizing different materials and different approaches, and that we utilize our technologies, if we have them, to the best that we can. Um, and then they call that final key element endurance. And there they're talking about really how do we cope with the stressors of a crisis, right? So as we think about resiliency and we think about what does it mean to be resilient, we also have to really understand that people are in highly stressful situations. And so we have to always keep that humanity in mind. So I know that there are a lot of administrators that are here in this conference. And so I also wanted to particularly speak to you as an administrator myself. So as we think about these elements, I think that what you'll also see here highlighted is that as administrators, we really have a duty and a responsibility to really think about policy in particular. We have to think about how are we going to implement, create, adapt new policies that really help us move forward with our adaptability and our change and our changes that we need to make in our environments. We also need to have more creativity in our policies to address some of the policies that are not working or are inequitable or have unequal outcomes for our students. We've got to make sure that we are connecting with our teachers and our students and that we understand their needs. It involves really having some difficult conversations sometimes so that we know what are the resources that we really need. Is it that our students and our teachers need more literacy in how to use the technologies, right? It's one thing to provide a device, but it's another thing to provide the training and the support for how to utilize those devices. So do we really understand what their needs are? How many of our students are food insecure? And are really in situations where the different crises that we are undergoing put them in situations where learning probably cannot actually be optimal because they're experiencing very big difficulties in their own families. And then we also have to really look at how different policies are addressing our challenges. And I think we also have to have varied approaches in terms of those policies. And then finally, as we think about the humanity of our students, the humanity of our teachers and our faculty, we've got to continue to keep in mind that we must have policies that really support physical as well as mental health and well-being, and that we continue to encourage continued teaching and learning. So as I wrap up here, really what I'd like to stress is that as we move into our new normal, that we really remember the importance of equity, the importance of access, and the role that we all must play as good advocates in terms of advocacy for our students. So thank you very much for your time. Khab Kun Ka. It has been wonderful to be here with you all, and I hope that you all have a fantastic conference. Again, I am so sad that I cannot be there with you all. I wish that I were in Thailand eating all of the amazing food, but I cannot wait to be with you all soon, hopefully in the near future. So thank you very much. And you all have a wonderful conference.